freelancers, and by the CWA Canada Associate Members, which is a free union membership for students, volunteers, and precarious media workers. If you are a freelance or associate member of the union, you'll have access to this recording of this webinar. As a freelance member, you can access the recordings through logging on to cmgfreelance.ca. As an associate member, you can access the recordings through the link in your e-newsletter that you receive each month. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, I'll ask that you just type them into the chat box on the bottom of your screen there, and we'll get to them after the presentation. And without further ado, I will now introduce our speaker, Emma Paling, who took on the Queen's Park beat for Huffington Post Canada in 2018 after 3 years as one of the site's news editors. Emma graduated with a combined honors degree in journalism and history from Carleton University in 2014. And so without further ado, I will take myself off the screen and we'll bring Emma up here to speak.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I am just wondering how to start my slides. Sorry. Give me one moment. There we go. Okay, hello, we're gonna get started. So my name's Emma Paling. I am the reporter covering provincial politics for HuffPost Canada. I'm gonna start out by just giving you a bit of background about my path to Queen's Park, how I got to reporting on Ford's government. So like Nasser said, I graduated from Carleton University's journalism school in 2014. I started freelancing when I was in 4th year. I sold a couple of stories I'd written for a reporting class to Vice Canada, and from there I just started freelancing more regularly, pitching news stories and lifestyle stories whenever I had time on top of working retail after I graduated. In 2015, I started working as a front page editor at HuffPost, so that just entailed like filing news stories, packaging wire stories, designing the homepage, and doing social media. But I always showed an interest in reporting, so they started giving me more and more time to do reporting. And before I knew it, I had a couple days of reporting along with front page. And then in June 2018, Doug Ford was elected Premier of Ontario. Our politics editor, Ryan Maloney, was pretty quickly run off his feet. There was a lot of news coming out of Queen's Park. It was sort of becoming unmanageable for the politics team that we had. Ford's government was just moving so quickly and so dramatically. It was hard to keep up, and the HuffPost team really wanted somebody else on the beat. So I raised my hand. I volunteered for some reason, and the past year has been an amazing learning experience and also a huge challenge as a reporter and as someone who was not joining a bureau. HuffPost had never had a reporter at Queen's Park before, so I've really been building our coverage from the ground up. These are all the reporters who cover Queen's Park, Ontario's legislature. So I counted, there's 26 reporters. I am only the 3rd or 4th from a digital-only outlet. So almost all of these reporters work for a newspaper or a TV or radio station. There are 2 or 3 other websites and 1 newsletter. So that just gives you a sense of how new it is for the reporters there to do online news first and foremost. It's still sort of an old school institution. So I'll start out by explaining what a typical day for me is when the legislature is sitting. It's been very different in the summer since the NPPs have a recess, but work always starts basically the moment I wake up. As soon as I wake up, I'm already behind. I've had mornings where I'm like trying to will myself out of bed and CBC News is on the radio and I can hear Mike Crawley, who's the CBC Queen's Park bureau chief, on the radio, and I'm like, oh my God, he's already live and I'm like not even out of bed yet. That just gives you a sense of how intense the workload can be. There is a lot of news all the time. You never are short of story ideas, that's for sure. So how I prep in the morning, I listen to Metro Morning, which is CBC Toronto's news show. They do a lot of really good provincial politics coverage. If you're in Ontario, it's a great way to start your day. Check my emails. I read the Toronto Star's daily newsletter. I read Queen's Park Today, which is a really neat subscription newsletter for people who have a really serious interest in provincial politics. They summarize everything that happened the day before and list out all the events that are happening that day. The legislature also has a news service which sends out clippings from the Star, CBC, all the newspapers. So I read that, check Twitter, see what the other reporters are working on. Then I check in with my editor, give him my plan, what I'm hoping to write about or cover that day. HuffPost has a story meeting at 10. So if I'm not there in person, I join a hangout, talk to my editors and my colleagues, tell them what I'm working on. They give me feedback if they think a story is going to be interesting or if I should kill it. Usually my plan totally changes within an hour after that because question period starts. So when the legislature is sitting Monday to Thursday at 10:45, there's question period, which is the opposition's chance to ask the government questions. They can address their questions to any member, usually the premier or cabinet, and then the premier can choose to give the questions to one of his ministers or answer himself. That's where a lot of news is broken, and it's just really good to get a sense of what issues the government is dealing with, what the opposition is finding problematic, what the government's messaging is going to be on a certain issue. If they've changed their messaging, that can be interesting. It lasts for about an hour, and then we literally go to crowd the doors where the ministers and the MPPs leave question period, and we scrum. So usually between 2 and 5 ministers will agree to take questions for that day. We all crowd around them, and you literally just have to like shout your question. It's really intense. That was the hardest thing for me to get used to when it comes to covering a legislature. They're a bit more civilized now because the legislature set up a mic. So you're not like physically crowding the minister. You have to kind of stand back, but it's really competitive. It's really hard to get your question. You have to have a lot of confidence, and that has been one of the biggest things for me to learn. That lasts usually for 45 minutes. Also, even if a minister is not scrumming, it's a great chance to just talk to MPPs, both from the opposition and from the government. They're leaving the House and going back to their offices, so you can just catch up with them, introduce yourself, ask them for coffee if you're hoping to interview them for a story or get them on the record. Then I eat. That's like the first half of the day. And then in the afternoon, I have to finish a story that I've pitched. So I usually have to chase a different interview to sort of counter what the minister or the government has just told me. There's always other press conferences, other events, government announcements. And then I file my story, sometimes more than one, sometimes a story and a video. And down at the bottom, I have between 5:30 and 7. I can usually go home, but it's a cliche to say there's no normal day, but there really is no normal day. There's been days when I work till midnight and forget to eat dinner. There's been days when I leave at 6 and I get to have a normal night. So one of the funny things about being in scrums is that you end up in the stock photos of the politicians. This is me with MPP Randy Hillier. And if you're me, your colleagues will make a meme of you because you look so unhappy to be there. So why report on provincial politics? I think this is a really great area for freelancers and for new grads to take an interest in. I'm so excited to be doing this seminar for you guys and to teach you about it because I really believe it's the most important level of government. A lot of people are interested in covering federal politics because it's sort of the most important, it's the most like glamorous, but provincial politics, I think it has a more direct impact on people's lives. Provincial governments, they're in charge of schools, hospitals, all of our court systems, police, public transit, colleges and universities, and then a whole long list of other social services and institutions. Like, these are just a couple examples: women's shelters, legal clinics, conservation authorities, and social services, like one that's become very controversial for the Ontario government, funding for therapy for people who have autism. Provincial governments also set policies that can really change people's lives. Often when I hear my friends who don't have an interest in politics talk about it, it's because something is going to actually impact them, like a change to the minimum wage. That's from the provincial government. Changes to rent control. Those things can really change someone's experience of getting a job or finding an apartment, and that's in control of the federal government or the provincial government. Also, there's some fun times. I have this weird obsession with pictures of politicians in hard hats and safety glasses. I just think it's such a funny visual. This is Minister Lisa MacLeod, who was previously in charge of the Ministry of Children, Community, and Social Services. I believe I tweeted this because she had skipped question period. There was some big controversy with her ministry, and she wasn't there to take questions because this is what she was doing. So there's some fun, lighthearted moments as well. I'm going to get to the boring stuff in a second. So like I said, provincial politics is so broad. This list is all the ministries that are part of the Ontario government. It's going to be similar for other provinces and territories, and it can even change depending on who's in power. So if I had put up this list 2 years ago when Kathleen Wynne was premier, it would have been different. The Ford government amalgamated some, like the Children, Community, and Social Services Ministry, that was previously 5 separate ministries. But this gives you a sense of the topics that you can research and write about if you're interested in covering provincial politics. So my first tip is definitely to choose an area of focus. Think about what interests you, what got you into journalism, what types of stories do you write, who do you like to interview. That can help guide you when you're trying to decide what your focus for provincial politics should be. I really think provincial politics is it's just too broad. You're going to end up overwhelmed, like I was for the first 6 months of doing this beat. If you're trying to cover everything, it's just not going to work. If you choose 1 or 2 ministries or just a general topic, you can build sources, you can become an expert on the policies and the laws that are part of that area, and I think it'll really go a long way in making you, a journalist who outlets want to publish and a journalist who readers want to read. Like I said, there's only 26 reporters in that photo of the Queen's Park Press Gallery. They're covering all the legislation, all the announcements from all of these ministries. There's maybe more ministries than there are reporters. So that's one of the reasons why I think this is such a great area for freelancers. There are so many untold stories. There are stories every single day that I wish I could write that I don't have time for, that none of the reporters in the press gallery have time for. And so I think that for freelancers, it's a really, really great place to be. There's a couple specific ministries that I just want to draw your attention to. So Cabinet Office, the very first one, I did not know that this existed until a couple months into covering the beat. There's actually a ministry that's just tasked with helping the government of the day carry out its agenda. So if you're filing access to information requests, for example, and you need emails or documents from the Premier's office, that actually goes through the Cabinet Office ministry. That's an entire ministry with a whole staff and a whole bureaucracy just to support cabinet ministers and the Premier. There's a couple others on here that I bolded: education, finance, health, and intergovernmental affairs. I bolded them because I think those are the ones that have the most news, that are covered most often. So if you're freelancing for an outlet that doesn't really have provincial politics coverage, these are good areas to start. If you're freelancing for an outlet that already has 3 reporters at the legislature, you should look to some of the other departments because you're going to find more unique ideas and stories that haven't already been pitched. So with the biggest responsibilities that all the provincial governments have in Canada is education and healthcare, right? They fund and design the whole system for public education and public healthcare. So there's a ton of policy, a ton of news all the time out of those ministries that, like the CBC, for example, is going to be covering in depth constantly. I also bolded finance because the finance ministry is the one that decides how the money is going to be spent. They write the budget. What are we funding? What are we cutting? What are we increasing funding for? That all comes out of the Ministry of Finance. So they make a lot of news. I also put up intergovernmental affairs just because the relationship between the provinces and the federal government is really important. It's become even more important than usual lately because a lot of the premiers are taking Trudeau to task. There's a lot of conservative governments in power across Canada right now that want to make an issue out of things that the federal government does. So there's a lot of high profile news coming out of that relationship. And lastly, I just want to flag the ministry that does college and university education. So in Ontario, it's called the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities. The minister is Ross Romano. If you're writing for a campus newspaper, for example, and you want to make sure that the topics you're writing about are going to be relevant to students at your school, this is the ministry that you want to learn and that you want to cover. So my suggestion is to choose an area of focus, 1 or 2 ministries, and learn the key players, learn who the minister is, who works in their office. There's a great tool in Ontario called InfoGo, where you can look up the email and phone number of anyone who works in any of these ministries or any of the ministers' offices. You can learn who the people are, what their jobs are, and learn what the major policies are so that you're familiar. We're going to get to why that's important in a little bit. So here are some basics of the legislature. Some of this will probably be familiar to anyone who's taken like politics reporting or anything like that. So bills are posted online when they're first tabled. That's when a bill is at first reading. So you can read the content of the bill online, what the government's trying to do, what their aims are. Then legislatures have the chance to debate the bill. You can probably watch live streams of that. In Ontario, you definitely can. So opposition MPPs criticize the bill, government MPPs defend the bill. Sometimes they say really weird stuff, make crazy analogies. Like I had one story about an NDP MPP who compared the PC government to Nazi, like a really famous Nazi named Joseph Goebbels. He did that during debate. So it's sometimes just worth it to have the live stream on. Just keep half an ear on it to hear what they're saying, because there's some really interesting stories out of the actual debates that happen on bills. Then bills go to committee. That's where MPPs actually hear from members of the public and interest groups about how they think the bill is going to affect their group, their life, society in general. You can get a lot of good story ideas out of committees, and you can often watch the committee meetings on a live stream as well. The committees also are going to vote on amendments. So if the government proposes something really dramatic and they decide to change their mind and take something out of a bill, that's going to happen at the committee stage. And usually on committees, each committee will have a majority from the government that's in power. So in BC, you're going to have most MPPs on each committee will be the NDP, because they actually vote on amendments. They have to win their votes. So that's how they're usually made up. After the committee votes on amendments, the bill goes back to the House. A new version of it is posted online as amended. Then the MPPs vote on it, it gets royal assent, and it becomes law. I have a couple other tips down here. So the order paper is the agenda for the next sitting day. So that's one of the other things that I read when I wake up in the morning. It's kind of convoluted to read, but it basically lists like what bills are going to be debated, what bills are going to be voted on, what's at committee, so you can get a sense of what's happening that day, what you want to cover. Basically, the legislature's website is going to become your best friend. Familiarize yourself with it, learn what's there, learn what the committees are. It'll be a very helpful tool. The standing orders are the rules of the legislature. That's a term that you're going to come across. So they dictate when the House sits. So there's always a fall session. They break for holidays. Spring session, they break for the summer. And even when the House is in session, they have constituency weeks. So in Ontario, every 5 weeks, they have a week off. There's no question period. There's no debates. No legislation can be passed. It's like ghost town in Queen's Park. That's when I go back to the HuffPost office and hang out there. The standing orders also dictate when certain proceedings happen, like what time question period starts, how long it goes for, when members can make statements, how long bills have to be debated. So that's really helpful because once a bill is introduced, you can kind of estimate when it's going to pass. And if you want to be there or cover the passage of a bill, you can sort of figure out what day it's going to be. Yes, I should have mentioned this earlier. So I have like physical access to Queen's Park because I'm a member of the press gallery. I believe they don't take applications from freelancers, which is too bad. So I was able to get a press pass for Queen's Park because I work for HuffPost. If you're freelancing, you're going to have to rely more on live streams. But luckily, there's live streams of question period. There's live streams of press conferences, debates, committee meetings, and there's a lot of other ways to find stories, which I'm going to get into shortly. So how to find news. Like I said, you can watch live streams if you are a member of the press gallery in your province. You can watch question period every day if you feel so inclined. You can watch press conferences when the premier is taking questions or when the minister in charge of the topic you're interested in is taking questions. Press releases, that's a really easy way for freelancers to know what's going on. Just Google the government news, like for your province. If you Google Ontario government news, there's a web page. You can subscribe to all press releases. You're getting those at the exact same time that all the other reporters in the press gallery are getting them. And you can know what's going on. And you can get the exact same documents that we get when we're physically at the press conferences in your inbox. Legislation and amended legislation. Obviously, when the government introduces a new bill, it's usually going to be big news. It's pretty tricky to just get news from reading legislation. Like if you're not a lawyer, to be honest, I've really struggled with that. Reading legislation is not easy. It's not meant for public consumption. But we're going to talk a bit more about that later. When bills are being introduced, the government talks about it in the House. You can get quotes. You can understand what's going on in other ways, but just straight up reading legislation is probably going to be a bit overwhelming at first. Officers of the legislature. These are my favorite. We're going to go more into depth about what they do and how to use them to find news, but these are independent offices that don't report to the sitting government, but they report to all MPPs. So they write reports on government activities. They take complaints from the public about specific topics, and they publish reports online that you can read. You can call them and ask questions. They're really great for making news. Committees, as we just talked about, I think committee meetings are a great place to find news because you're hearing from members of the public on how they think a bill is going to impact them. Often at committee meetings, you'll hear people testify like really critical things about the government, and they could be great sources. Also, committee submissions. So when a witness is coming to committee to testify about a bill, they bring a paper submission that all the MPPs on the committee are supposed to read, outlining their argument, if they are welcoming the changes, if they think it's a good thing, if they think it's problematic. You can read them, quote from them. It's a really great way to understand what people are saying about new legislation. Stakeholders and interest groups. This is massive in provincial politics because there's so many areas of law that directly impact people. There's unions, business associations. Like it's such a long list. If you get familiar with a few that you really want to write about, you can get really good stories from sources that way. And then freedom of information requests. We're not going to go into this like too in depth because I think I'm going to go a bit over time today, but if this is something that you've used before, or if you want to follow up with me and get more information, I can send you an email. It's just a great way to get access to emails, briefing materials, documents that you might not have had, and answers to questions that aren't public yet. I've starred the last 3: committees, stakeholder groups and interest groups, and freedom of information requests, because in my opinion, those are going to be the best bets for freelancers. You can find stories that the beat reporters who are at the legislature every day aren't paying attention to. And I think you'll probably have more success pitching that type of story. So what is a question period story? These are typically like really quick and easy to write. I have 2 examples of stories that I wrote. I probably finished these in a couple hours after question period, or even 1 hour. Doug Ford ducks abortion question by tapping one of his ministers to bash the carbon tax. So this was a wild day. An NDP member asked the premier in question period, do you support publicly funded access to abortion? He referred the question to another minister. He refused to answer. So he asked the Minister of Energy, Northern Development, and Mines to answer. And Greg Rickford stood up and started talking about how their government is not concerned about this. They're concerned about making life more affordable by fighting Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. So that was a great story. There's tons of reader interest in it. And like I said, I probably wrote that in 1 hour after question period. I didn't have to chase anyone new. I didn't have to get an interview. I can just write it off of my recording of their comments in the House. So these are great stories to write for an outlet that doesn't already have much politics coverage. You could literally get a new story idea like every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, when the House is sitting. Sometimes it's a bit boring, but often, especially in Ontario right now, this is where like the fireworks happen. And like I said, you can watch a live stream of it from your couch. You don't need access. You can just record it and have their comments there, or you can read a transcript that gets posted on the legislature website. And tweeting during question period is a really good way to build a following. A lot of people who are like sort of politics nerds pay attention to reporters' tweets about what the politicians are saying in question period. The second example, Ontario Tory asked constituent to delete post about their meeting. This I got through something that the NDP brought up. So often during question period, the opposition will list examples. My constituent called me this morning and she is distraught because the government is ruining her life. You can follow up with those MPPs. Hey, I'm really interested in talking to that constituent you mentioned in question period today. And I got a really successful, unique story by following up with one of the NDP members who brought this up. I don't think she had even explained the whole situation in question period. So this NDP member just said, like, her constituent was really upset about the government's changes to the autism program. So I was the only reporter who followed up and asked for this woman's name. I spoke to her and she ended up telling me this crazy story about how she met with her MPP, and the MPP said she totally agreed with her. The government was screwing it up. And she wrote about it on Facebook. And then she got all these late night messages from her MPP on Facebook saying, like, I need you to delete that. I can't disagree with the premier. It was like a really good story. And I got that just by following up with an NDP member who had heard from a constituent that day and quoted them in the House. Press release stories. Okay, so this is gets a little bit more interesting. So press releases are obviously going to come out when the government has a major announcement that it wants people to pay attention to. Often a press release will coincide with a press conference where a minister is actually going to take questions. If you don't have access to the legislature and you're not going to be in scrums, this is often your only chance to ask a question or to actually hear a minister go off script. So even if you're not a member of the press gallery, you can, depending on your situation, who you're writing for, you can probably get access to the press conference. The minister will speak. they hand out paper copies of the press release, and then you can line up at a microphone and ask a question about it. Sometimes you really have to dig to find out what the actual news is. Often the government has one message, and what you're going to tell your readers is going to be something totally different. So my example up here, one of the things that has been really controversial in Ontario is the government's changes to OSAP. So OSAP is the student assistance program for post-secondary students when the government gives you grants and loans for your university degree or your college degree. So the government press release was government for the people to lower student tuition burden by 10%. That was their press release. They're cutting tuition rates by 10%. This was our headline that day. Ontario government axes free tuition for low-income students. So I'm going to show you how I found that. I apologize, my GIFs didn't work. This is supposed to be a GIF of Matthew Perry going, I have no idea what's happening. So on the press release, there was actually no information about the free tuition program. But the press release was accompanied by a backgrounder, which is often included, with more information about the affordability of post-secondary education in Ontario. So our first clue was there was a quote from the Auditor General that said the changes to OSAP that took effect in 2017-2018 cost considerably more than the province anticipated. So if you didn't know that free tuition for low-income students was introduced in 2017-18, you're not going to know what that's referring to. That's one of the reasons why it's really great to have a specific area of focus. And down here was the actual news. So at the very bottom of the backgrounder, we're like 4 pages in now. There's bullet points, and one of the bullet points includes provide some provincial loans to low-income students. So previously, low-income students had only gotten grants. They didn't have to pay back anything. That's why it was free tuition. Now they're going to get loans. That's actually where the news came from. The Ontario government axes free tuition for low-income students. It was like a tiny bullet point on the second page of the backgrounder. It was nowhere in the press release. They were trying to advertise that they were cutting tuition rates. It really depends what type of government you're covering. You know, conservative governments who are cutting spending, you sort of learn the clues as to how to find these things, and it really helps to be familiar with the policy in the area that you're writing about, because to be honest, the first few press conferences that I went to like this, I didn't understand what was going on. You know, the initial changes to the autism program, they make it sound really great, and then you hear from stakeholders, and then you figure out what's really going on. So this is just, I think, a really good example of how that works and how you have to really pay attention. Always read the backgrounder if there is one, read it carefully, and that's how you can find sort of the real news. Officers of the legislature. This is another great way to find unique news if you have time and interest in reading long reports. So these are really fun, but I'm a bit of a nerd, so I love it. These are, like I said, independent offices that serve the legislature and report to the government on its own activities. Over here, I have Peter Weltman with a star emoji. Peter Weltman is the Financial Accountability Officer of Ontario, and I love his reports. They're almost always newsworthy. So his job is keeping the government accountable on its finances. So he writes reports on how much they're spending, how much things are costing, and his office does projections. So his office is the reason why I had this story. Ontario's 2019 budget will leave the healthcare system billions of dollars short. So a couple months before the Ontario budget came out, Weltman's office did this analysis on healthcare spending where they said, you know, for the next 5 years, we have to increase spending this much just to keep up with population growth. That's just to maintain what we have. Well, when the Ontario budget came out, they weren't increasing it by that amount. So I could just quickly compare the numbers and show that, you know, in 2 years, we're going to be $5 billion short because our population is getting bigger and our population is aging. We're actually not going to have the same services that we have now. Another example of a really great officer of the legislature is the integrity commissioner. I checked for every province. So I believe our participants today are from Ontario, BC, Alberta, and Newfoundland. I believe all of them have an integrity commissioner or ethics commissioner. So that is an independent office that's tasked with making sure all the politicians are following the rules for conflict of interest. There was a huge controversy in Ontario when Doug Ford's friend got appointed to be head of the provincial police, Ron Taverner. And these officers of the legislature can write a report anytime any MPP requests a report. So an NDP member asked the integrity commissioner to investigate. He put out a report that was like 120 pages or something like that. He had interviewed the premier, interviewed his chief of staff, interviewed all these members of cabinet. He had text messages, emails. It was like really, really juicy stuff. And because I just stayed up really late that night reading the whole thing and summarizing it, I got this really great feature play-by-play of everything that the premier's chief of staff had done to make sure that this man had sort of he didn't get him the job, but he, there was a bit of favoritism towards him, certainly. And that was from the integrity commissioner's report. So every province is going to have a list that you can find online. I have links for all the provinces that you guys are from. I'm going to give you my email address at the end. If you want that link, just send me an email, and it's really fun to explore. There's offices that do like audits. So there's always an auditor general who will do value for money audits. You can get great news out of the auditor general's reports. They're like 400 pages. So it helps to control F and to have that topic that's interesting you so that you can just read the chapters that are relevant. There's like police complaint commissioners, commissioners who just advocate for kids or seniors. You can get tons of great news from these officers of the legislature. Okay, committees. So I want to talk a little bit more about government committees, which study the legislation and pass amendments. Like I said, they're great places to find what different groups think about proposed legislation. So this first story did really well. Ontario PCs want to stop tracking toxic waste. Experts say it'll cost us our health. This came from a committee where an environmental group gave their submission and testified that this one clause, the PCs were retracting an old Liberal bill. They said, it's going to be really bad. There's going to be more toxic chemicals in the air and in the water. I got this really great feature story. I think I got distracted, and that story took me like 4 or 5 days, but nobody else reported on it because a lot of reporters don't go to committees. So if you can watch the committee live streams or just check, the committees will post their agenda for that week online. Just look up who's testifying. If you're interested in the environment and it's an environmental group, just call them, ask them for their submission, ask them what they have to say. There's all types of interest groups that you can possibly imagine testifying at committees. The second one, Ontario amendments to Bill 57 strip even more powers from the environmental commissioner. That was another great exclusive that I got just because someone had tipped me off that these amendments had been posted. No other reporter had actually read the amendments, but they drastically changed the bill at the amendment stage. And so it was sort of like they're getting rid of this officer of the legislature, the environmental commissioner, but they said that the reports were still going to be written, and then they amended the bill to actually say that there's not going to be reporting. They like ununionized all of her employees. It was like quite dramatic what they did in the amendments. And you can find a story like that just by checking what the amendments are on a bill. And then lastly, this story about how there was a section of the budget bill that changed the way juries are selected. And the chief of Six Nations had come to committee and said, like, this is a great idea. It's going to include Indigenous people on juries, or people on reserve for the first time. People on reserve had never been part of jury selection before. And that was a great story that not many people knew about, that I just got from checking who was testifying and reading the transcripts of the committees. We're almost done. I know it's been dense. I just want to talk to you a little bit about stakeholders and interest groups. So like I said, these are huge for provincial politics. There are so many interest groups. You really need to do your due diligence and verify, because there's a lot of people who have a stake in provincial politics. There's a lot of misinformation and people pushing a certain agenda, but you can totally do it. And I think it's one of the best ways to get exclusives is by building relationships with sources within this category. So an example for a stakeholder could be like a teachers union or a school board, a municipal government. They get tons of funding from the province. The list is seriously so long. My suggestion is, sorry, my phone's ringing. My suggestion is, once you decide what area of interest or ministry you want to write about, read a bunch of articles, just read a bunch of news articles about that topic and make a list of the groups. There's going to be like advocacy groups or stakeholders that are quoted, people that are quoted. Just keep a list, and that, you know, you should start by reaching out to them and introducing yourself. Like I said, the examples can be big and broad and powerful, like a teachers union, or it can be, for this example, a parent of a person who has autism. That has become a community that has been so helpful for me in my reporting. I've joined a few Facebook groups because this has been such a political issue. There's Facebook groups for parents of kids who have autism in Ontario, where they trade stories and advice and talk about what the government's doing. I just request to join. I identify myself. Hey, I'm a reporter. Here's like 2 stories I've written about this. You know, don't publish screenshots if you don't have people's permission. Be very responsible, but you can find sources that way. And that's how I got this amazing story that did very well for us about a mom who, she had 2 sons who both had autism. One of them had really high needs and he really needed therapy, and the government wasn't giving him any support. Her other son, who had more mild autism, he got a $20,000 check in the mail. She had just written about this on a Facebook group. Someone who I had interviewed before showed me a screenshot of it. It took me like 3 weeks to chase her down, but she gave me an interview, and I got this amazing exclusive that really demonstrated the problems with the government's plan. This other story, Ford told people to call him for legal aid. Here's how his office really responds. So these were documents that someone got from a Freedom of Information request. It wasn't even my request. It was a lawyer who had done it. But I covered the cuts to legal aid very extensively, honestly, mostly just because I noticed that no one else in the gallery knew about it or was writing about it. And it's a big issue. Like, they're cutting hundreds of millions of dollars. It's really going to affect people. So I wrote a whole series about that all summer. And to be honest, a lot of the stories didn't do well. Like, not everyone was a hit. But because I had written about it, this lawyer, when he got the documents, he just texted me like, oh, I just posted this on my blog. Maybe you want to read it. And it was an amazing exclusive. We had copies of emails from the Premier's office showing, like, he's saying, if you need legal aid, just call me. And then when people followed up, they weren't helping them. That was an amazing exclusive that I got just because I'd built relationships with the lawyers who work in this area. Okay, I see a few questions coming up. When you're trying to join a Facebook group, how do you work around the admin questions that often require you to be a member of the special interest group when you're not? Do you identify yourself as a reporter at that stage? Yes. Hi, Bailey. I would identify myself as a reporter as soon as possible. It might mean that you're going to get rejected from a few Facebook groups. Not everyone trusts reporters. Not everyone wants reporters in their Facebook group, but you need to find a group that has an admin that wants you there. So often there's questions. There's often questions when you join a Facebook group that would be like, where do you live? What's your relationship to this issue? I mean, I answer honestly and as soon as possible. Some of them have a character limit, so you can't really explain. But as soon as possible, I try to type like, I'm a reporter trying to cover this issue. And if it doesn't let you, you can look at the admins and just send them a DM. That's the easiest workaround. Okay, I have a couple other questions. I'm going to answer them just at the end. I think that's actually almost all I had to say. There's something else that I want to add about stakeholders and interest groups. It's really important to build relationships with these people and keep in touch. I am like constantly on my phone answering texts, Facebook messages, Twitter messages, calls. That is a really great way to get more stories that other reporters don't know about. So like I said, this mom came because someone sent me a screenshot of her Facebook post. I had just kept up this kind of casual correspondence with a woman who is a therapist for kids with autism. She has a huge stake in this policy, right? And so she just messages me every once in a while, usually checking in with people once every 2 weeks. Once a month is good. Just like a text or a Facebook message. Hey, how's it going? How's your family? Have you heard anything about what the government's doing? Have you heard any crazy stories lately? Like, it's really important to keep up your relationships with those people. It shows that you care, that you're not just like sucking them for their stories, and it also will get you access to stories that other reporters aren't going to get because they simply didn't check in and say, hey, how was your week? Did you hear anything this week? That's also how I got the legal aid one. I had just kept up in regular contact with this guy because I was interested in what he was doing, and he ended up showing me the documents before anyone else. And so that is almost the end. This was supposed to be a very exciting GIF. The key takeaways: believe in yourself. You can do it. Provincial politics is super intimidating at first because it's so broad, but if you choose an area of interest and do your research, I really believe that you can be really successful reporting, pitching freelance. So I see one question here from Sherry. How do you know who to pitch your story to at an outlet to publish? Does freelance mean free? Freelance does not mean free. You should be paid for your work. So when I started freelancing, so I was a student, but I would write an article and sell it to Vice. So Vice Canada would pay me $150 per story. It's not a lot, but it's like, you shouldn't be doing it for free. You should get something. They might ask you what your rate is, or they might just tell you how much their rate is. I think $150 for a news story is still probably standard. The better you are, the more you build a reputation, you'll get more. It might be less depending on the outlet. It might be more. And how do you know who to pitch your story to at an outlet to publish? So read, if you're pitching a story to an outlet that's already covered, they've probably covered something related, either politics or provincial policy somehow. Pitch the person who last wrote about it, or try to find an editor's email. So a lot of editors these days have their email addresses in their Twitter bios. I do. I know a lot of editors do. Using Twitter is a great resource. If you can just find one or two people who work at that outlet, if you at least know you have the right email, or you can maybe do like a LinkedIn message to ask them for their email. As long as you get it to the right outlet and make it really clear at the top of your email, I have a great story to pitch about provincial politics, they'll forward it to the right person. As long as you can get someone at that outlet, that would be my advice. And you should not be working for free. You should be getting paid, unless it's like, a local blog that has no budget. I really think you should be getting paid. You deserve to get paid for your work. I just took up 50 full minutes. It was supposed to be 30. Does anyone else have, I forgot the first question. Is there a specific story that you've done that you're particularly proud of? Ooh. Yes. Definitely. I'm really proud of the coverage that I've done on the autism file because it was something that a lot of reporters were writing about, but I actually got a lot of compliments on some of my reporting because I learned a lot about the policy. I know it pretty inside and out at this point, and I wrote this one feature about in the US, it's considered medically necessary. So obviously they don't have universal healthcare in the US, but if you have private insurance, they have to cover these therapies that people in Ontario don't have access to. And I wrote an article about that, how it works in the US. It was amazingly successful. I thought it was like a policy wonk, boring story, but like tons and tons, thousands of people read that story. And a lot of people in the community started reaching out to me, and they know me now because I wrote that. Another story that I was particularly proud of, just my work on the legal aid beat. There was a few stories that I broke this summer that the Toronto Star followed the next day. And I'm normally not competitive, but that made me really proud. I had a couple stories before anyone else about legal clinics that were laying people off because their budgets had been cut. And again, that came from building relationships with the stakeholders, texting them, emailing them, and I sort of became their go-to person just because I was the one always in their inbox asking what's going on. Oh, the government has an announcement about this tomorrow. Are you going to go? Do you know what it is? Have you heard any rumors? Like, people who are really passionate like having those conversations, and a lot of people are very happy that a reporter is taking an interest. So I really think keeping up relationships with your sources is one of the best things you can do. Do you have any tips for getting an MPP or office to respond to requests for comment? That is one of the hardest things to do. So often when you need comment, you send an email to the MPP and they ignore you. You never hear back. Certainly, that's one of the advantages of actually being in the press gallery. I can like physically stand outside of these people's offices, and often they still refuse to comment, but at least they saw me, they know I'm writing a story. You know, if they refuse to comment in person, it's usually like really bad. They don't want to talk. I would just say be persistent. So once you email, call. I would say call the same day that you email. Don't wait a week, they haven't emailed you back, and then call. Like, send them an email in the morning, 2 or 3 hours later, leave a voicemail. The next day, leave a voicemail again. If you really, really need it, I would say call twice a day until they at least acknowledge you. They still might not give you a comment, but if they at least say, no comment, we are refusing to do questions on this, you have that. That's all you need for your story, and then you can write. After 17 phone calls, MPP Joe Schmo refused to comment. It feels annoying to call someone constantly, but that's our job. 17 is excessive. I would say call once or twice a day for like a week and then stop. But they can't say that you didn't do your due diligence. And unfortunately, that's just a fact of our job. Is often there's going to be people who stonewall you who just don't want to answer. If they're local and you're in the town or city that they work in, you can go to an event that they're having. Don't ever misrepresent yourself. If you're asked at the door who you are, you have to like tell them that you're a reporter. They might turn you away, but going up to someone in person, it's kind of scary. But a lot of like, these are just people. That's one of the biggest things that I've learned. Like, I chat with Doug Ford in the elevator, and it's just like, it is what it is. You know, they have power and it's intimidating, but you can, if they're having a community barbecue on a Saturday, you can go. And if the story is really important to you and you have a long deadline, just go up to them. Hi, my name is Bailey. I'm writing an article about this, and I think it's really important to get your thoughts. Your office has ignored 10 of my phone calls. Is there any way? I think it would be really great to include your point of view. If they still say, no, 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 I don't want to talk about it, like, you're out of luck. But if you want to go that far, I think that's totally appropriate. What are the main barriers to entry for young journalists when beginning to cover provincial politics or trying to cover provincial politics? Any advice for getting past these? Ooh, that's hard. Sorry, I'm getting thirsty. I've been talking so much. My biggest challenges were just getting the confidence, first of all, to approach the MPPs in person and to go into scrums and to ask questions at press conferences. My advice in that case is just practice. If you have a roommate or a friend, or you can do it with them in front of the mirror, practice out loud what your question is. If you have time, if you know what it's going to be, just get used to saying it so that when you're in the moment, you're not like searching for words, like flipping through your notebook, trying to remember word for word what you're going to say. Just like get to a point where it can come out comfortably. It doesn't have to be word for word the exact question, but like, hey, I really wanted to ask you about OSAP. What's going to happen to these students who used to get free tuition, now they don't? I talked to Ed, who is in debt now. Like, just get used to saying it, get comfortable with the subject matter. That's a big help. Other barriers for young journalists, I would say it's just like quite intimidating subject matter. You know, it's really hard to know if what you're reporting is right sometimes because you're like relying on like reading legislation, your interpretation of the legislation. It's very dense policy stuff. In that case, my advice is take your time, make sure that something is going to be correct before you pitch it, before you publish it. If it means calling 2 different experts, 3 different experts, it's worth it. It's a lot better than reporting something that's going to turn out to be wrong. Take your time. And I would say, like, maybe that's why it might be a good idea to pitch a few features or longer form stories first before doing a lot of like hard news, because often you'll have to turn around hard news within like 3 hours of the announcement. That can be more stressful than like, hey, I'm going to write this feature on, you know, these parents who are worried about a teacher strike. You could take all week to do that. And I think that that will make it a little bit easier, a little bit less intimidating, and more manageable. So once again, this was supposed to be a GIF. It is a picture of Rachel from Friends. Ask me anything. I'm here for you. I'm really excited that people wanted to do this webinar. I would love to hear from you, who you are. If you have further questions for me, like seriously, email me. This is my Twitter and Instagram handle. You can send me a message. I'm here for you. I would love to hear what kind of stories you want to write. If you publish something about provincial politics, I would love to read it and share it. Definitely get in touch. And if you want a copy of my notes, I know the slides were like very bare bones. If you want a copy of the notes that I was speaking from, which have links to the different officers of the legislature for every province, send me an email, emma.paling@huffpost.com, or send me a tweet or Twitter message. Email is better. I'm kind of hiding from Twitter right now because there's some farmers who are mad. Send me an email. I'll share you on the Google Doc that has all my notes. It might be a little bit more helpful, and then you can just follow up with me in an email if you have any further questions. Is there anybody else in the chat who wants to ask a question? Anything I didn't explain clearly?
Hi guys, I just wanted to jump back on here and to thank Emma for that incredible overview of covering provincial politics. That was very dense. There was a lot of great information in there. And guys, if she's willing to take your emails and answer those extra questions, I definitely advise you to do that. Emma has done some incredible work, whether it was around autism cuts, legal aid cuts, the impact on students from these tuition cuts. She's done some really, really incredible work this past year. So definitely hit her up. Maybe not on Twitter because of those angry farmers, but definitely make sure you please email her when you have a journalist like this that's willing to connect with you. It's vital that you sort of take advantage of those opportunities. So once again, I want to thank you so much, Emma, for doing this, for taking the time out of your day. I know it's a Saturday, so again, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Of course.
And lastly, I just want to say that this webinar has been brought to you by CMG Freelance and the CWA Canada Associate Members Program. If you are a freelancer, you can access this recording and past recordings by going to cmgfreelance.ca. If you are an associate member, you can find the links in your e-newsletter. And once again, I want to thank you guys for attending this and actually taking the time to listen and hear Emma out. I should also add that if there are any topics that you guys would like to see us cover in future webinars, let us know. Both Catherine Lapointe, who is another organizer with CWA Canada, and myself, we're always very open to hearing from you, our members, on issues that you would like to see covered. So with that, I'll say thank you so much, and we look very forward to hosting you guys again in the future. So thank you so much. Hope you have a great weekend.